I'll begin with a quote from Robert Graves from his book, The White Goddess, a historical grammar of poetic myth. Quote, "True poetry, inspired by the muse and her prime symbol, the moon, even today is a survival or intuitive recreation of the ancient goddess worship." Robert Graves, World War I poet, author of Goodbye to All That and the novel I, Claudius, and the literary criticism of Greek myths and the White Goddess, at the age of 51, created a self-portrait poem entitled The Face in the Mirror for television broadcast in the late 50s. I'll show it now, and it's incorporated into my new work, Selfies.
Grey, haunted eyes, absent-mindedly glaring from wide, uneven orbits, one brow drooping somewhat over the eye, because of a missile fragment still in hearing, skin deep, as a foolish record of old-world fighting. Crookedly broken nose, low tackling caused it. Cheeks furrowed. Coarse grey hair flying frenetic. Forehead wrinkled and high. Jowls prominent, ears large. Jaw pugilistic. Teeth few. Lips full and ruddy. Mouth ascetic. I paused with razor poised, scowling derision at the mirrored man whose beard leads my attention, and once more asked him why he still stands ready with a boy's presumption to court the queen in her high silk pavilion.
The mother said they were golden eyes, the same since birth. The third has no visible colour above. Upon the forehead, a notch diagonal, where poker cut skin as a babe falling from pram. The nose is slightly bent, punched by a drunk, dark sorceress, later exiled for black arts. Furrowed brow, long lineage of worry lines from frown to clench of mandible. Stiff upper lip. Stained central incisors, caffeine and tannin. He recycles pink razors from his muse, still sharp from her young legs. Every other day, cheeks and Adam's apple scraped smooth. At the age of 50, he has the face he deserves, but the maiden sees it better than his mirror.
I was brought up with art as process. My parents were both art teachers at the school I went to. So I was visually literate well before being able to speak, read, or write. And my dad was heavily influenced by Herbert Reed's 1943 publication, Education Through Art, in which Reed argues that art can be used as a pedagogic instrument with which to teach many, if not all, subjects. So some of the images that were available to me and that I remember from being young, preschool, school. This is Matthias Grunewald and also with Nicholas Hagenauer. It's the Eisenheim altarpiece. Grunewald is responsible for the painting, and Hagenauer for the sculptural quality of the altarpiece, between 1512 and 1516. And you've got various aspects there. On the left, you've got Saint Sebastian. Then in the middle, as in with all triptychs, in the middle is the crucifixion, and Saint Anthony on the other side, who was a desert father who sort of wandered in the Egyptian desert for years. And then underneath you have what is subtitled The Body of Christ. And it's oil on tempera on limewood panels. And this is it in situ in Colmar. And then also by the artist Artemisia Gentileschi, female Renaissance painter, Judith slaying Holofernes, 1614 to 1620. So late Renaissance, Mannerist. And then on the left, Diego Velázquez, Pope Innocent X, 1650. And on the right, Francis Bacon, Irish-born artist, 20th century painter. Study After Velázquez's Portrait is the title. So Study After Velázquez's Portrait of Pope Innocent X, 1953. So they're both discrete works. They're not exhibited as one work together, but the second one on the left refers to the first one. And then Lyubov Sergeyevna Popova, so Popova as we know her, translate the title as Costume Design for the Magnanimous Cuckold by V.S. Meyerhold, 1921. So it's a design for theatre costume. At art school, I quickly began to see the canons of art, or the canon of art, painting, sculpture, architecture, as territories that needed deterritorializing in order to make them critical and to extend them. My practice has engaged art with place, pedagogy, and politics across 4 decades. I'm not limited to one mode of working. My practice is underpinned by what Martin Irvin of Georgetown University might call a visual culture approach that acknowledges the reality of living in a world of cross-mediation in which visual content and codes migrate from one form to another. And just to add to that my practice isn't limited by that which is only the visual, but visual culture as an approach is a good way of accommodating a lateral move and discursive move through different kinds of approaches to making cultural production. So, painting, photographs, sculpture, video, sound, apps, digital works, works with archives, curating, art writing, publications, performance, walking, work with archives, curating, performance, apps, publications, walking, and epic running. So here, just to put it all in one slide, because we're going to move on and not focus on this. For example, I ran across the edges of the Roman Empire in Britain. So I ran across Hadrian's Wall, which is the ancient Roman wall that runs from the west to the east, or the east to the west. 74 miles in a day. And the Romans got a little bit further up. They couldn't hold out that long against the Picts in Scotland, so they had about 40 years with another wall, which is about 50 miles maybe. Ran that in a day, the Antonine Wall. And then, of course, their frontier went across Europe, down to the Black Sea, down through what is now Syria, across northern Africa, etc. And I started that, so I ran across Holland in a day. So epic running, out of which other things come, and poetry. Yeah. I saw at art school and beyond, I saw naively perhaps that performance as a primary means to bypass the art object and gallery and to break out of the confines of the canon was a useful strategy. With performance, I could cut out the art object and get right to the core of social relations between myself and the viewer, audience, witness, spectator, me, you. My task was one of becoming a nomad, traveling across the borders of the known territories of the canon. Plaster and paint and bronze, etc., were no longer the obvious materials. Not that I'd ever made anything out of bronze, but kind of there you go in terms of the canon. Being and doing now set the scene in which authority as a social relation, the power between you and me, became the primary material. Later, I would find this reflected in the writings of Deleuze and Guattari. I have to say that my interest in art was such that I wanted to extend the envelope of its approaches as opposed to leaving behind its land entirely. Found objects and found images were used to retain a link with what, in my linear and probably reductive way of thinking, were the past disciplines of art. I was travelling on a train to Dover from London in England. It was early and we were moving at a snail's pace. Old rolling stock. I'd left the Slade School of Fine Art and was on my way to northern France to start a 6-month residency that I had been awarded on completing my postgraduate. It was a Brussels initiative in preparation for the emerging European Union. So this is in 1990. and the European Union was brought together in its current state in '92. A French Anglo-cultural initiative was what I was involved with. I had with me an archival image that I had found in the Imperial War Museum in London, an image which had Anonymous as the photographer, an image of the Western Front in 1915. Funny enough, I had a copy of Robert Graves's World War I autobiography, Goodbye to All That, which I was reading. I produced many works whilst in France, and central to them was the sequence of 32 photographs entitled Fortress Europe 11 to 42. Here's a few more of the sequence. This work dismembered and enlarged fragments of the found archival image that I mentioned I was carrying with me in order to arrive at 32 interdependent works. By probing the original in this way, I was able to pull out new subjects for inspection: tree stumps, spades, ammunition cartridges, distant figures, a thumbprint on the original glass slide. So a number of truths began to emerge in the work that I produced. The work mined memory. At that time, in 1990, World War I was still within living memory. The work speculated on the future, the imminent Greater Europe of 1992, a Europe that promoted productivity through relaxed internal border restrictions at the expense of those left on the outside, the margins of a fortress Europe, a refugee crisis in the making. As a philosophical principle, an idea of history that incorporates the past, the present, and the future isn't a new one. It is one rooted in the German concept of Geschichte. It is a principle that continues to suffuse most of my work. So when this work is shown, it's not shown in a grid format in order to reveal the original, an idea of the original. It's shown as a sequence of images like this, separate images next to each other that are, in a sense, portrait-sized. Okay, so I'm going to read you a quote from a cultural geographer who passed away recently, Doreen Massey. And this is from A Global Sense of Place from Space, Place and Gender. One of the problems here has been a persistent identification of place with community. Yet this is a misidentification. On the one hand, communities can exist without being in the same place, from networks of friends with lay interests to major religious, ethnic, or political communities. On the other hand, the instances of places housing single communities in the sense of coherent social groups are probably, and I would argue, Doreen Massey would argue, have for a long time been quite rare. Moreover, even where they do exist, this in no way implies a single sense of place, for people occupy different positions within any community. We could counterpose to the chaotic mix of Kilburn. Kilburn is an area in a part of London in the UK. We could counterpose to the chaotic mix of Kilburn the relatively stable and homogeneous community, at least in popular imagery, of a small mining village. Homogeneous? Communities too have internal structures. To take the most obvious example, I'm sure a woman's sense of place in a mining village, the spaces through which she normally moves, the meeting places, the connections outside, are different from a man's. Their sense of the place will be different. This is back to me now, I want to set in context my own establishment of a new aesthetic format. This has involved a derivative of the guided walk and pilgrimage that I distinguish via the term maneuver. So maneuver as a word is from the Latin manu operare, manus, hand, and operare, to work. And then later it evolved into our popular understanding or understanding of it being a tactical movement, hence the military use the term maneuver, being on maneuvers. By the use of the term guided walk, I refer to any organised walk that involves a group being led by one significant individual whose role involves imparting information along the way. By the use of the term pilgrimage, I refer to those walks of intention by groups or individuals that operate as ceremonies of observance along routes that are consensually understood to hold sacred or secular significance or importance. This way of practice, this mode of practice, utilizes the walk of intention as a means of developing a discursive performance that resists the dominant naturalized conventions of landscape and travel-oriented works. My research focuses upon my own artistic methodology and approach to contemporary art practice, focused as discursive performance and distinguished from other categories of performance art or live art by describing them as maneuvers. Each maneuver involves the recitation, the reading aloud of quotations, each of which have been brought to bear upon the route through pre-designed association with particular stopping points along the way. The quotations have been taken from various subjects and amount to a discursive web of information. Through this discursive performance, the combinations of documentation, textual exploration, guide publication, and live presentation, the work, the performances and the publications being the work, propose my work as a new mode of performative practice based upon the politics of the decentered body and the performativity of history, the doing of history. My aim has been increasingly to work with the notion of the environment being structured as a language. And with this in mind, the research, development and production of many maneuvers have distilled themes pertinent to the multi-layered identity of a locale. Now, I'm aware that the New Zealand environment may well be structured quite differently as the language of environment that I've been working with in continental Europe and the British Isles. Indeed, it may well be that New Zealand being bicultural means that its environment has more than one accepted or lived grammar. As with any environment worldwide, there will be many who do not accept that an environment is structured as a language, and many who would not be aware of it. So it's contested on a number of levels. It's contested as a proposition that I'm making and others have made. It's also contested perhaps within a country such as New Zealand, where there would be an agreement about the nature and quality of the grammar of the land, but maybe levels of awareness that are not cognizant with it. The combinations of citation and the stopping points, which I call stations, exist as singular instances within a wider interconnecting web of recital in and recital out of place. The subjects and field of interest are not determined by one discipline, so they're not determined by map making, cartography, the 1930s, the body. Rather, they're trans-historical and discursive, and they exist as a kind of mosaic, so different quotations along the way that pull you in different directions of thought, some of which contradict each other. The form of the maneuver regards place as being complex, and in so doing has opened up each work to a wide range of disciplines and focus. So in the case of A Cut, this is the title of this work, A Cut, the maneuver illuminated sites in London's East End. That's a very kind of provocative statement, East End. It's not really a good statement to use, the East End. London's E1, all of which might be conceptually bound by an idea of fractured or incised body. All the quotations were connected to ideas of the fractured or incised body. In so doing, the work brought together, ranged over and plundered texts from the disciplines of neurology, criminology, philanthropy, mythology, romanticism, cosmetic surgery, and contemporary art criticism. Through its reference to the Elephant Man, the Crow Twins, Jack the Ripper, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and the artist, French artist Orlan, who pioneered an idea of live cosmetic surgery as performance, and she was having an exhibition in this area where the walk was taking place. So John Merrick, the Elephant Man, also known as Joseph Merrick in the film, this was the hospital where he lived and died, actually. And various other aspects that I've talked about along the way, references were in the locale, Jack the Ripper, death sites, etc. In addition to members of the general public, participants along the way included specialists in psychotherapy, history, art history, and geography. Surfacing from these performances, these manoeuvres have been a series of publications, pamphlets, essays, and articles that combine elements of the artist's book with that of criticism. The utilization of the walking tour as a vehicle to understand this has also offered this practice up to public scrutiny. The work has been registered in academic journals on history, architecture, geography, and contemporary art as a new approach to understanding concepts of space, place, memory, and history. The discursive capacity of the maneuver as a form has enabled me to write about it from the perspective of a historian for History Workshop Journal. Elsewhere, it's formed the basis of contributions to architectural and geographic publications. So this way of working has enabled me to inhabit other disciplines. The maneuver's ability to move in and out of the official understandings of place, conventional maps, and their supporting histories and mythemes, and in so doing to introduce renaming strategies and other perspectives amounts to a form close to Mikhail Bakhtin's dialogical understanding of the heteroglossic text, which I'm not going to go into right now, okay? Because time is short. In the context of Bakhtin's heteroglossic text, the maneuver incorporates into its imaginative form a range of different texts, both written and the texts of the site, the environment as a text, into its framework. So it includes the idea of phenomenology as being a text, the weather as being a text. It draws not only on quotations but on particularities of its given environment as experience directly. It draws on what is ready to hand in relation to being present as witnessed, in a way that the German philosopher Heidegger referred to as Dasein. Each reading that I make along the way, or that participants offer to recite, can then be considered as a node within the broader network. This network is not limited to any one time space. Bakhtin's chronotope being conceptually open to any historical moment or source. The maneuver takes advantage of this to produce works that traverse the conventional linear approach to history. In addition, the existence of guidebooks carries the maneuver beyond a localized notion of an ephemeral event in time to that of an historically registered object through time. The notion of a heteroglossia, which is an overall textual weave or web of a work of imagination, coupled with the time-space, the chronotope, might be understood as the critical aspect of the maneuver, whereby the polyphony of places, the multiple geographic and historical zones of a route, and their voices, the multiple quotations recited or ventriloquized by myself, and subsequent readings come together to form discursive performances in process, distinct from other modes of delivery. So the accumulation of all of this work, forms a plank in an argument that I have for experiential knowledge, which is heteroglossic in nature and which tests generalized notions of interdisciplinarity, site specificity, intervention, performance, poetry, and the memorial. So it tests all of those concepts. And it can be analyzed in terms of alternative threads of thoughts, such as the zone, place, and history. So my work forms a methodology that has emerged over time as a resistance to notions of objecthood in art. In turn, this methodology, which is that advocates a discursive performance, has made possible new works of imagination. Each maneuver, each work is a new work of imagination. This performative approach utilizes process in the public realm to open out discursive potential to both producer and participant. Vedute maneuver, Vedute, was produced for the Venice Biennale in 2011 as part of an exhibition entitled The Knowledge, curated by James Putnam. It was particularly interested in the idea of the physical and psychological view of an environment and how it might affect our knowledge of a place. This is especially pertinent to Venice when one considers the development of Venetian art. Canaletto was an exponent of what was to become known as veduta, a view painting. This performance and publication was specifically interested in the idea of the physical and psychological view of an environment and how it might affect our knowledge of a place. I adopted a number of Canaletto images of St. Mark's Square as waymarkers to form the spine of a route to be walked by participants. Actually adopting a range of Canaletto images sounds like it was an easy process. Well, there was a bit of a few hoops to jump through, because who owns the majority of Canalettos is Queen Elizabeth II. So you've got to buy the rights. Could be any organisation, but it happens to be Queen Elizabeth II. You've got to buy the rights and apply for the rights, the copyright rights, in order to be able to reproduce them and use them. Anyway, I paid for that and got permission. The walker in the vedute manoeuvre utilised a collection of view cards, each of which, they're about just under A3 size, just over A4, each of which presents a different Canaletto reproduction, each one a view of St. Mark's Square. The reverse of each view card carries a quotation that contrasts that of Canaletto's image, whilst keying into the city's fictional and factual past. For example, the Campanile, the bell tower, we've got one here above the old museum building, the bell tower, is coupled with a Marinetti quote. Marinetti was Italian futurist. In fact, he wrote the Manifesto on Futurism. And the Manifesto on Futurism was launched by Marinetti in 1910 from the top of the bell tower. So he threw out lots of copies or pages of the Futurist Manifesto. And the quote on the back of this view card, which is a Canaletto drawing, funny enough, of the bell tower being rebuilt, because it had fallen down at one point, maybe through an earthquake, possibly, I'm not sure. And the quote on the back is a quote from that relates to Marinetti's action of launching the Futurist Manifesto. So it's a quote from an art history book about the event. The most successful, this is it, the most successful happening of that period was the launch of a manifesto against past-loving Venice from the bell tower of St. Mark's Basilica. In the flyer, Marinetti calls for filling the small stinking canals with the rubble from the old collapsing and leprous palaces, to prepare for the birth of an industrial and militarized Venice, capable of dominating the great Adriatic, a great Italian lake. So he didn't really like old buildings. So I'm also interested in the way in which Canaletto's success was in part built on the production of views of Venice for sale, mainly, to English gentlemen on the grand tour. Supplementary quotations would also allude to this aspect of the Venetian experience, linking the past grand tour to present Biennale festival goers. So, for instance, here's a bit of a quote on one of the backs of the view cards. The British idea of Venice as the locus of decadent Italianate allure made it an epitome and cultural set piece of the grand tour. The periods of travel, this is not a quote, this is me, the periods of travel between each stopping point enables conversational exchanges, attention to the built environment and everyday phenomena. In this way, the artwork sucks the everyday into its framework. So these walks that I make are not interventions. They're the opposite of intervention, because they suck the everyday in, as opposed to puncturing the everyday. The Vedute publication, or portfolio, also carries an essay by Heather Young, who is a specialist in spatial engagement in poetry and who I'm currently collaborating with on a series of works. So by this stage in the process of my development and research, I was thinking of my manoeuvres as epic poems that embraced a range of voices from the past. In 2005, I was invited by the Museum of Contemporary Art and by the Pedagogic Museum in Belgrade, Serbia, to create a manoeuvre through the city. This presented me with a healthy problem. I'd never been to Belgrade before, and the window for the visit offered no research time in Belgrade, no research time on the ground, and I like to spend time on the ground, being there, working it out, and negotiating being a foreigner or not, depending on where I am. Okay, so I decided then to turn my method inside out, as it were. Instead of being the guide, I would be guided by the participants. I would make it explicit that I wasn't going to parachute in and present a definitive view of their city before being airlifted out, like many public artists do, and big public sculpture arrives and then they go off to the next one. We would video the entire walk, but treat the camera unself-consciously. So the camera would be passed around, and you didn't have to look through the viewfinder. You could just carry it like that. It would just roll constantly. Okay, so I'm going to tell you an anecdote of something that happened along the way. This happened to be a student. This person here was an architectural student, and she said, "Oh, I'll be the guide now." People took turns at being the guide, and when they got bored, they could pass on that role. And great, and she said, and I'll try and do it as I remember it, okay? She said, "Let me take you to Unbuilt Museum of Revolution." And I was like, right, okay, Unbuilt Museum of Revolution, wow. So we went over this grass area in the center of Belgrade, and in the distance I could see these three objects, and then I could see that they were red, and I thought, right, okay, Unbuilt Museum of Revolution is public sculpture. Okay, it's a modernist public sculpture. You with me? Yeah. But it wasn't. These are the stanchions of a building that was going to be the Museum of Revolution. And then when the Civil War started and developed, the Milosevic, who was the president, inverted commas on and off, ran out of money to finish the project of building the Museum of Revolution. So all that remained were the beginnings of it, foundations and the basements below. So you move onto a concrete area, paving stones with gaps where wires would have been then fed up, but are holes where you can see down into the basements, and then these stanchions, which happen to be red. Okay, and she said, "Look, homeless people living in Museum of Unbuilt Revolution. So we looked through, she pointed and we followed her point and a direction, and we looked down into the basement, and there were many people sleeping under the ground. And for me, kind of the top of my head blew off. You know, it presented me with, this was a really powerful experience for me, as it shook me at a core level in terms of art, politics, history, performance, and in terms of learning. I'd been taught something, quite literally, and taught by a guide who had come to the event perhaps with the expectation of being guided. The practice of walking as a device for teaching is not new, but it is underdeveloped. Socrates used walking as a way of metering out conversation, which resulted in his dialogues. On closer inspection, the word pedagogy, which we generally understand to be the method and practice of teaching, especially as an academic subject or theoretical concept, is rooted in the synthesis of Greek words argo, I lead, and paidos, child. Pedagogues accompanied children on the walk to school in ancient Greece. And today, in Denmark, for instance, the word pedagogue is given to preschool teachers. Preschool teachers. With this in mind, I began thinking of my use of walking as an art practice in relation to learning and my practice of teaching. And I began to develop projects with students in UK art schools where I would use walking as a way, as a mode, as a vehicle within which to teach. I soon realized that I had also been using walks as a mechanism for conducting tutorials from time to time over 15 years previous to this at Dartington College of Arts and at Goldsmiths colleges, but nothing consciously modelled as those that I then began to develop at Chelsea School of Art and Manchester Schools of Art. Okay, so every year the MFA students go on a hui during the summer. They're invited to a kind of summer retreat. And this year we were based at Riversley in Otaki. I wanted to introduce walking as an aspect of our engagement. When I moved to New Zealand, I realized that there are traditions of walking with intention. Among these is the hikoi, which is generally understood as a kind of protest march, but I've come to understand it doesn't have to be a protest march, but that's kind of how it's been adopted. Hannah Smith, our co-head of School of Art, has been using hikoi as a method in her research on climate change adaptation, which is funded by the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, and is focused through conditions of the Otaki region where Ngatai Tukorere, Hannah's iwi are located. Hannah's research is collaborative on many levels, and she has included architecture students and staff from Victoria University in aspects of it. So with this in mind, we invited a group of Vic architecture students and staff to walk with our MFAs on a 2-hour discursive walk along the Otaki coastline, beach, dunes, wetlands, to a Herimihi, Wakata, Whakato at the marae. Students were asked to consider a range of questions, including so these are so they split the questions up. So the Vic architecture, Victoria University architecture students had these questions already in mind. How does Papa Kainga work on the ground? What Maori values should be important to your design? What is feasible in terms of shifting dunes, making wetlands? What is your position in relation to space? And then we had two more questions that I and Eugene Hansen brought to the groups, both groups, so to our MFA students and to the Vic students to consider. What is your position in relation to space, this space? And what is your position in relation to place, this place? As with other pedagogic approaches to the manoeuvre, a video camera was handed around the group whilst we walked. Again, anyone holding the camera was not expected to consider its setup or position. It rolled as we walked. Okay, so I'm going to read some of the responses to the questions from the MFA students. They're not named, they're anonymous, kind of ethical agreement there. And while I do that, we'll view a short sequence, a couple of minutes or so, from a very long video footage, extensive video footage.
Have you had a go with the camera yet?
I just take it like
Yeah.
this.
Just do whatever you want.
Okay. I give you the camera.
This approach to walking and teaching has opened out a new level of research that I am at the threshold of. It has led me to an evaluation of the preconceptions of learning and teaching, the teacher as expert and the student as novice. The process of learning as a process of unfoldment as opposed to score or knowledge, a score of knowledge. Now, the French philosopher Jacques Rancière has set this up really well in his work, The Ignorant Schoolmaster. So this is a quote from The Ignorant Schoolmaster. "Whoever wishes to emancipate someone must interrogate him in the manner of men and not in the manner of scholars, in order to be instructed, not to instruct. And that can only be performed by someone who effectively knows no more than the student, the ignorant schoolmaster." This is the way that the ignorant schoolmaster can instruct the learned one as well as the ignorant one, by verifying that he is always searching. It's not about opposing the knowledge of the people to the science of the schools. It's about recognizing that there are not two levels of intelligence. In all cases, it is a question of observing, comparing and combining, of making and noticing how one has done it. So a next step for me is the writing of a book entitled Pedagogy Through Performance Art, Navigating the Crisis in Art Education. That's what I need to do. I need to write that. Okay. In 2003, I was invited to be artist in residence at the British Museum to mark their 250th anniversary. The British Museum is the world's oldest museum. That's how it markets itself. And they asked me if I would produce a work that linked all 10 departments. All 10 departments of the British Museum do not talk to each other. They don't talk to each other. The museum is founded on 3 collections, one of which was John Dee's library. John Dee, was a 16th century mathematician, alchemist, Queen Elizabeth I's astrologer and natural philosopher, and occultist. Shakespeare's Prospero is modelled on the living contemporary to that time, John Dee, in Shakespeare's Tempest. I proposed to the British Museum that the work would reference the fact that the British Museum was founded on magic. Said the British Museum. They clearly like to think that they are founded on science. And they also said, this is not I didn't write it down, so this is not a direct quote, okay? "We feel that the use of the term magic is disrespectful to some cultures who still hold to supernatural beliefs." No problem, I said. Now, John Dee spent the last 7 years of his life allegedly communicating with angels. In a very short period of time, he transcribed a language of angels which were communicated to him through his assistant, Kelly. We know this language to be called Enochian, and it's still used today in occult practices. Now, if deconstructed Enochian, made it up, which he may well have done, then it's a remarkable feat because he brought it together in a very short time and it hangs together extremely well as a new vocabulary. So I went back to the museum and I said that all 10 departments had within their collections some kind of winged intermediary being, an angel, whether it be a Christian angel, a non-Christian angel, good, bad, or indifferent angel. Bored angels. I wanted to produce a tour of all the angels in the museum. They replied, "Yes." "Great. Is there a catalogue," I said, "of all the angels, like a museum list of all the angels?" "No," they said. "Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll compile one as well that you can use. So anytime you want to kind of refer to an angel or find an angel, there'll be a list as well. So I'll do that work as well as make a work." Which I did, which turned into this. Okay, 2 anecdotes. The British Museum gets extremely crowded, and official guides have various means of keeping their groups together. Many have bespoke flags, some use umbrellas. It's very packed. Some of you may have been at the British Museum. I used my raised arm with my hand making this sign. It's commonly used by, well, I show my age, by heavy metal fans, right? And it can relate to the twin horns of the devil or the all-seeing eye. It crosses many cultures, and it isn't always associated with the dark side. On my first tour, sounds like I'm a rock band now, doesn't it? On my first manoeuvre around the British Museum, I was stopped by a gallery attendant who got quite irate, stopped me and the group, and insisted I stop doing this. Despite me explaining to him the context of the work, he pursued the group, followed us around, and later reported me to his superior. I had a meeting with him and his manager and the curator of contemporary art where everything was straightened out. The attendant was Greek, and his name was Angel. The tours were repeated. All of them went through room G1 FC 20, where in a glass case John Dee's black mirror is located. This is of Aztec origin and was used by Dee and his assistant Kelly to scry, as the museum describes it, Dr. Dee's magical mirror. Oh, hang on a minute. I thought you weren't going to use the term magic, British Museum. Okay. This is what it says on the label. Dr. Dee's magical mirror, magical speculum, obsidian, wood case covered in tooled leather with label in handwriting by Horace Walpole. Quotation from a Samuel Butler poem, Hudibras, from 1663, and the Butler poem read, Kelly did all his feats upon the devil's looking glass, a stone, where playing with him at Bo Peep, he solved all problems, ne'er so deep. Now, on one occasion, my brother Damien arrived with his daughter, my niece Miranda, to join the tour. It was a hot summer's afternoon. The tour lasted over 2 hours, after which Damien and Miranda were rushing off on foot through London to the Globe Theatre to watch a production. Miranda, my niece, is named after Miranda in The Tempest, it being the first time that the name entered the English language. So Shakespeare was the first person to introduce the Latin Roman name Miranda into the English language through the play The Tempest. For those of you who don't know, the Globe Theatre is built on the site of the original Globe where Shakespeare presented his plays. The main auditorium is open air, standing room with covered seating and stage on the circumference. So the main area is standing room only, and the seats go around. The next day the phone rang. It was Damien. He said something like this: I need to tell you what happened after we left. We headed to the Globe. As we walked, it became very hot and the pressure dropped. Walking along a very old arterial route in London. When we got to the Globe, we bought a copy of The Tempest from their bookshop. We were then in the standing room near the stage. It was packed, dark clouds gathered overhead. You know, Tim, the opening sequence of The Tempest is a tempest with thunderous clouds. Well, the weather was thunderous, brooding. Just as the play began, Miranda, my niece, fainted. She was not conscious to me, or the surroundings. Unbeknownst to us, this is my brother, unbeknownst to us, the director of the theatre, the English actor and playwright Mark Rylance, was watching from a vantage point, and he alerted St. John's ambulance who got Miranda out and backstage. When she came round, she was oblivious to everything that had transpired. While she recovered, my brother, had told Mark Rylance about us having been on your tour. It made me wonder. John Dee, the Elizabethan major, this is from The Tempest. As Prospero, John Dee, the Elizabethan magus, created a multi-part symbol which he referred to as the monas. The monas, or monad, is an assemblage of astronomical glyphs that, when brought together, expound, in Dee's view, a concept of the cosmos, a treatise of everything. So these bit parts are brought together. They include elements and other glyphs that relate to astrology. And they brought together, they read as everything. Many things may be, this is John Dee, many things may be deduced from the diagrams which, it is preferable, should be studied silently rather than divulged openly in words. Meantime, let us inform you of one thing amongst many others, disclosed now for the first time by us. In respect of this new art, this monad has been integrally and physically restored to itself. That is to say, it is truly the monad unitissima, the proved unity of the images, and it is not within the power of nature. Neither can we by any art promote it, in it, any movement or any progression whatsoever, unless it be by 4 super-celestial cycles or revolutions. And from this monad is engendered that which we wish to note as the manner and course of its eminence, and for this reason, that there is not in the elemental world, nor in the celestial or super-celestial worlds, any created power or influence which cannot be absolutely favoured and enriched by it. Search for the ultimate unit. Somebody said when I did this a few weeks ago, they said, when are you taking the transfer off your back? That was quite good, actually. And this brings us back to the selfie, where the broken fragments of the modernity are seen in relation and coordination with the past. I'm currently collaborating, as I said, with Heather Young on the adaptation of poetry to television broadcast. In her 2015 publication, Spatial Engagement with Poetry, Heather writes, "The tripartite nature of our spatial engagement with poetry and poetics demonstrates the important manner in which geographical, ecographical, topographical, or spatial criticism of poetry can operate on an ontological level, not totally divorced from the thematic aspects of these fields of study, but certainly engaging concerns from a much wider field. The ramifications of a spatial engaged reading of the poem on its own terms is not only applicable to numerous poetries from a number of poets and ages, but is also a critical necessity in order to preserve the integrity and allow for the poetic power of, in intimate relation to, each other, and in no particular order, the reader, listener, the author, authors, and the text itself." My grandfather was with the British Army at Gallipoli in World War I and evacuated in 1916, in January 1916. He was at Suvla Bay with the British Army, okay? The program Heather and I are working on, so we're working on a program, televisual broadcast program, takes the form of a video diptych involving the dual locations of the Gallipoli Memorial at the Dardanelles, Turkey, with what amounts to its designated twin, the Ataturk Memorial at Tarakana Bay, near here, Wellington, near Miramar. Incorporated into each section is a recital of Byron's poem, Darkness, written in 1816. My grandfather was evacuated from the Dardanelles in January 1916. The footage from the following section of the overall work was shot in 2016. So 1816, 1916, 2016. Okay, so what the text that you'll hear recited is Byron's poem Darkness. It's about 6 minutes long.
I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and went and came and brought no day, and men forgot their passions in the dread of this their desolation, and all hearts were chilled into a selfish prayer for light. And they did live by watchfires and the thrones, the palaces of crowned kings, the huts, the habitations of all things which dwell, were burnt for beacons. Cities were consumed, and men were gathered round their blazing homes to look once more into each other's face. Happy were those who dwelt within the eye of the volcanoes, and their mountain torch, a fearful hope, was all the world contained. Forests were set on fire, but hour by hour they fell and faded, and the crackling trunks extinguished with a crash, and all was black. The brows of men, by the despairing light, wore an unearthly aspect. As by fits the flashes fell upon them, some lay down and hid their eyes and wept, and some did rest their chins upon their clenched hands and smiled, and others hurried to and fro, and fed their funeral piles with fuel, and looked up with mad disquietude on the dull sky, the pall of a past world, and then again with curses cast them down upon the dust, and gnashed their teeth and howled. The wild birds shrieked and, terrified, did flutter on the ground and flap their useless wings. The wildest brutes came tame and tremulous, and vipers crawled and twined themselves among the multitude. Hissing but stingless, they were slain for food. And war, which for a moment was no more, did glut himself again. A meal was bought with blood, and each sate sullenly apart, gorging himself in gloom. No love was left. All earth was but one thought, and that was death, immediate and inglorious. And the pang of famine fed upon all entrails. Men died, and their bones were tombless as their flesh. The meagre by the meagre were devoured. Even dogs assailed their masters, all save one, and he was faithful to a course and kept the birds and beasts and famished men at bay, till hunger clung them, or the dropping dead lured their lank jaws. Himself sought out no food, but with a piteous and perpetual moan, and a quick desolate cry, licking the hand which answered not with a caress, he died. The crowd was famished by degrees, but 2 of an enormous city did survive, and they were enemies. They met beside the dying embers of an altar place, where had been heaped a mass of holy things for an unholy usage. They raked up, and shivering scraped with their cold skeleton hands the feeble ashes, and their feeble breath blew for a little life, and made a flame which was a mockery. Then they lifted up their eyes as it grew lighter, and beheld each other's aspects, saw and shrieked and died. Even of their mutual hideousness they died, unknowing who he was upon whose brow famine had written fiend. The world was void, the populous and the powerful was a lump, seasonless, herbless, treeless, manless, lifeless, a lump of death, a chaos of hard clay. The rivers, lakes, and ocean all stood still, and nothing stirred within their silent depths. Ships sailorless lay rotting on the sea, and their masts fell down piecemeal. As they dropped, they slept on the abyss without a surge. The waves were dead, the tides were in their grave. The moon, their mistress, had expired before. The winds were withered in the stagnant air, and the clouds perished. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe.
So just want to say thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Dougie. Thank you, Kevin, for the work in here. Dieft do dia dul in enocht, diat, which means may your God go with you. Tena koto, tena tato, katoa. Thank you very much. I know.
Thank you.
You've probably all got another class to go to.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to have to call time because we have another class who are ready to start.